America is often compared to ancient Rome and its impact on the world. In my opinion, as a Greco-Roman descendant myself, I think that comparison has no reason to be, but today we are not here to talk about whether America, the country, is a contemporary of ancient Rome or not. Today we are here to discuss the possibility of if the Romans discovered and subsequently colonized America, the continent. So how could that crazy and unlikely alternate history begin? Very simply. The discovery of the Americas would be purely coincidental and accidental and not intentional. Not intentional in the sense of not wanting to find a new route to Asia, as was the case for the Europeans. The best Roman ships, which were indirectly based on Carthaginian ships, which in turn were based on older ship models, the Phoenician ships, the latter having been able to explore and traverse long distances a millennium before Rome or Carthage, demonstrating the gigantic efficiency and technological prowess that those fleets were. On a technological level, the Romans had fleets perfectly capable of handling the difficulties of crossing a sea as vast as the Atlantic, although the ability to sustain several sailors for months until they reached the Americas alive is not entirely certain. But for the sake of this scenario, let's assume that Roman sailors would be able to survive such a hostile and extreme voyage. So how could the circumstances lead to an accidental discovery of the New World 1500 years earlier than in our timeline? Well, the Romans, contrary to the image they had in that regard, were indeed capable of being great explorers of distant lands, and they had the capacity and human curiosity to discover the most distant lands far from their empire, not being a characteristic unique to the Greeks and their explorers of centuries before the Roman occupation. You have to keep in mind that in my videos, whenever I make a map of the Roman Empire adapted to the alternate scenario I'm presenting to you, my maps are mostly functional, and they don't have the purpose of detailing in an extreme degree all the details of how the administration and true extension of the influence of the power and reach of the Roman Empire to how it was in reality, simply because it would take me too much time to draw maps as detailed as those. That's why sometimes, to distract myself while I'm editing my videos, I put on a time-lapse video of the historical evolution of the Roman Empire in the background, illustrated on an extremely detailed and carefully crafted map. And the last of those videos that really impressed me with its level of care and extreme detail comes from the user K Pard and his most recent video about the history of Roman civilization each month. If I'm talking about his work in that last video of his, it's because in it, we find perhaps the most detailed time-lapse video of Roman history that has ever existed on YouTube and perhaps on the entire internet, even bothering to represent places as insignificant as Roman outposts, with one of those being the prominent Roman outpost of Mogador, known today as the city of Essaouira on the coast of Morocco. And if I'm talking about a Roman outpost, you guessed it, it's because that outpost was commonly used for more in-depth exploration of the West African coasts outside the Mediterranean, with the inhabitants of that area and Roman representatives taking advantage of the outpost to explore and trade with the peoples of the now-known Canary Islands of modern Spain. The outpost of Mogador has been under Roman control or influence since at least the time of Augustus, so it would not be unreasonable to begin our historical divergence around the time when Augustus became the first emperor of the now Roman Empire. Let's say that one day, while a group composed of Romans, Greeks, and Berbers were returning from a few weeks exploring the multiple Canary Islands to trade with their inhabitants, that group, composed of 500 men divided into 3 fleets, would find themselves trapped in a gigantic storm that would brutally shake the ocean, making them unable to navigate in optimal conditions, completely losing control of their fleets, and being taken to the opposite side of the direction they were going. By the time the gigantic storm had passed and the waters of the Atlantic had calmed, the 3 fleets would have been completely lost in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and without compasses, and only being able to orient themselves by the stars, the sailors would have no other option but to continue advancing towards the extreme west, thinking that returning now towards Africa and the Mediterranean would be too far and dangerous, deciding to continue advancing forward, perhaps hoping to reach the coasts of the distant Asian empire that rumors and stories they heard of. But after many weeks of an extremely dangerous and hostile journey for the sailors' health, with many having already died of disease or dehydration, finally, the 3 fleets, which by some miracle had been able to stay in contact and united, would have finally set foot on land. But contrary to their expectations, the sailors did not land on lands belonging to a grand and advanced Asian civilization that rivaled the Roman Empire in grandeur and refinement, but on a tropical and humid lands with no signs of civilization or urbanization. Unbeknownst to them, these Greco-Romano-Berber sailors had discovered the Americas, having landed on the island of Cuba more than 1,500 years before the Spanish in our timeline. After having extensively explored that island and having interacted with the people who inhabited it, mainly the people known as the Siboney at that time, and after extreme difficulty in communicating with them, they would manage to exchange and trade goods with those primitive peoples, with them managing with great difficulty to make the sailors understand that the island was in reality a small part of what really constituted a gigantic continent further west of Cuba, where the most advanced peoples and civilizations at that time were found, if they can be called civilizations, of course. Intrigued by this information and in need of more resources and resupply before setting out on the high seas again, the Greco-Romano-Berber sailors would venture further west into the waters of the Gulf in which they found themselves, finally reaching the eastern coast of the gigantic American continent, landing on the coast dominated by the ancestors of what we know as the Mayans. These were not yet the great urbanized and centralized civilizations they would eventually become, being still quite primitive peoples composed of multiple small villages practically autonomous from one another, but eventually the sailors would find a people advanced enough to trade and exchange the resources necessary for their great return to the old world. Interactions with the Mayans would be complicated due to the language barrier, but they would not necessarily be hostile and aggressive. The pagan Romans were much more tolerant and indifferent especially to cultural and religious differences, and nevertheless considered themselves the most sophisticated civilization in the world and superior to all others anyway. But beyond that, they would not have arrived in the Americas with colonial intentions, yet nor with a desire to forcibly convert the locals to their religion, since anyway, among the sailors there were surely many of them who practiced different cults from one another, especially the Berbers. After having lived peacefully among the Mayans for many weeks, having traded and learned from them and those new lands as much as they could, and having finally fixed their ships and had all the necessary resupply to attempt again the dangerous crossing of the Atlantic Ocean to return home, the Greco-Romano-Berber sailors would finally begin their journey, unaware that they left behind them multiple diseases that the bodies of the indigenous people of America would not be prepared to receive, being a devastating blow to all their people, as we all know. I think the sailors would have a worse return trip than the previous one, suffering enormous losses and casualties that would leave the crews in a terrible state, with many dying of disease and dehydration, and being affected by diseases they brought from the New World, although not with the same severity as the diseases they left to the Native Americans. But for example, I find it hard to believe that during the time they spent among the Native Americans, none of them would have not been intimate with some of the women of those lands, risking that some of them would bring with them to the Old World diseases like syphilis hundreds of years before it originally occurred, which could have enormous consequences for the Roman Empire in terms of diseases if one of them had intimate relations with people from the Old World upon returning home. By the time they returned, of the initial 500 sailors, only 100 had survived the terrible journey that began as an accident, but the survivors undoubtedly had a lot of information and riches to deliver to the highest authorities of the Roman Empire. Upon their arrival, the surviving sailors would do everything possible to obtain the immense privilege of being able to meet the Emperor Augustus in person and tell him everything they experienced on that tumultuous journey to unknown lands, and after several weeks of extra travel to Rome, plus a lot of paperwork and organization to be able to speak with the Emperor himself, a privilege without equal for that merchant class, the meeting would finally take place. The Emperor would find himself fascinated and quite entertained by the stories that the sailors had to tell him, although doubtful of the veracity of the sayings of those sailors, but fortunately they had many proofs to prove that their sayings were at least partially true, because from their long journey the sailors brought back many objects, goods, clothes, and above all, unique foods from those distant lands that they had discovered. Now, what kind of food could they have brought back from the part of the Americas they explored? Well, to start with, and most importantly, corn. A versatile, easy-to-store, and adaptable grass that could have a major nutritional impact in the Mediterranean. But also, other foods or ingredients such as chili, avocado, beans, and of course tomato and chocolate, two ingredients that would have been essential to the Italian cuisine of the descendants of the Romans many centuries later in our timeline. And what about the potato? Well, no, they wouldn't have known about the potato yet because by the 1st century BCE, the potato would only be cultivated by the many peoples of South America, who would one day become the peoples known as the Incas, for example, but not the Mayans in Central America, not until much later, and therefore being an ingredient that the sailors would not have been able to bring to the Old World yet. In any case, the expedition to these new lands, although accidental, would bring enormous consequences but also benefits to the Roman Empire. With the arrival of new vegetables and legumes, if adopted and cultivated correctly in the appropriate areas of the empire for their development, they could change and even revolutionize the Roman diet and nutrition. Although without access to potatoes yet, corn could be a great start to being an easy food to grow massively, and that could feed the humblest mouths of the empire much more efficiently, thereby accelerating and facilitating Augustus's desire to increase the population of the Roman Empire as much as possible, something that in this timeline he would partially achieve thanks to these new foods. For the next few years, I don't think any expeditions to the Americas would be launched again, simply because of how dangerous and extremely expensive the journey was, and because there was still so much to do around the known world. But Augustus would nevertheless invest a great deal of money in the research and innovation of naval technology to make ships better suited to ocean travels for possible future voyages to the Americas. Foods brought from the Americas would gradually become enormously successful, especially corn and beans, which would become staples in the diet of the empire's poorest classes. Easy to produce and accessible to the majority of inhabitants, these foods would allow for a higher quality of life for the empire's poorest, and therefore a considerable increase in population over the decades. Due to the increase in population, and therefore to a number of soldiers in the Roman army greater than reality, it is possible that in this reality, with the gigantic advantage that foods such as beans would offer to the Roman soldiers, that they, although with many difficulties, many losses, and betrayals of supposed allies, would eventually manage to conquer Germania, or at least a part of Germania, by the end of the reign of Augustus. With more stabilized borders, with a decent increase in population, and therefore of labor production in all areas necessary to maintain a society as complex as the Roman one, during the rest of the 1st century CE, the Romans would finally focus their interest once again in obtaining more information from those distant lands that gave them so many benefits with their food brought from there, although also with the horrible sexually transmitted infections some of the sailors brought with them, and that was causing unparalleled havoc in the Roman world, especially among prostitutes and slaves. Tiberius, eager to legitimize his reign and reputation by shouldering the enormous responsibility of succeeding Augustus, and this, despite not being his initial desire, it would probably be him, would resume the expeditions to the Americas, this time being a totally intentional trip and massively financed by the emperor, sending several fleets composed of thousands of men and an entire Roman legion to more concretely explore that massive piece of land that the sailors spoke of decades ago. The ships would have been greatly improved and modernized over the last few decades, increasingly resembling the Spanish caravans of the late 15th century from our reality. But to the surprise of all those thousands of men, by the time they arrived on the shores where the original sailors once landed, the place would be found massively depopulated, with many villages completely abandoned and left in ruins, being surprised by that almost apocalyptic image of those barbarians. Wondering what the hell had happened, the Romans would go deeper into those lands, looking for answers about the massive depopulation of those areas, asking the locals with the little information they kept about their language based on the stories and writings of the original sailors. They would eventually learn that decades earlier, shortly after the sailors left for the Old World, a terrible plague had swept through the entire region, massively depopulating the entire area of Central America. And without the infrastructure and urbanization that these people would experience centuries later, they would not have recovered from that terrible plague, and the population would not have once again increased at all. Although unfortunate and being very cautious for fear of also getting sick, the Romans could not resist the temptation of conquering part of that area. With that part of the continent practically unpopulated, the Romans would have a completely free route to colonize and permanently establish themselves there, finally deciding that the Yucatan Peninsula would become part of the first Roman colony in the Americas. And so, the thousands of men who embarked on that adventure would decide to settle in these new lands and begin urbanizing and civilizing that part of the world over the next few years. While a few men would return to the Old World to report on the situation, the rest of the fleets and the entire legion that was with them would begin their process of urbanization and Romanization of the area. Over the following months and years, with their improved organization, weapons, armor, and fleets, the Romans would have no problem subduing the indigenous populations of the Caribbean islands, with the vast majority agreeing to integrate into Roman control since they were still quite unpopulated areas, and thus creating a direct trade route with the Old World, founding many coastal cities that would serve in the following centuries for maritime navigation and trade. For the rest of the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, Rome would develop its trade routes with them, further exploring that gigantic continent from north to south, although they would only maintain a concrete presence in Central America. Although some trade with the natives would be interesting and very beneficial for the Romans due to the resources and wealth of certain areas, initially, trade with the natives would be very limited and diminished, and that would last for several decades because wherever they went, the Romans left behind multiple diseases and plagues that would massively depopulate the American continent. For a long time, the profitability of these colonies would be mainly the production of resources and agricultural exports from those lands, with the Romans eventually managing to interact with the peoples of South America who domesticated the potato, finally being able to export it to the Old World, once again revolutionizing and completely changing the diet and population prospects among the lower classes of the empire. Although not everything was great, the continuous interaction with the Americas would have brought to the Old World multiple diseases and specific plagues that would have also affected the economic and population development in some parts of the empire, but being smaller in scale than the plagues that the indigenous people of America would have experienced. Ironically, the Romans would have become accustomed to these diseases, with their organisms largely developing immunity to them over the decades and generally having better health and quality of life due to the superior nutrition they had thanks to foods such as beans, corn, or potatoes. And as a fun fact, it is likely that thanks to their adoption of the tomato and their understanding of how to use and cook it properly, foods like pizza, as we know it today, would have been invented by the Romans almost 2 millennia before our timeline. In this alternate scenario, Rome is the world center of trade. It was no longer them who wanted to trade with China. China wanted to trade with Rome, for them to also obtain all the riches and strange foods that they had, with Parthia doing everything possible to interrupt and destabilize those trade routes between the two great powers. By the time of Trajan, Rome's population was enormous. With the introduction of corn and later potatoes, the empire's population would have tripled compared to our timeline, reaching a population of around 200 million. In this timeline, the powerful of the empire would not distract the humblest classes of the empire with simply circus and bread, but with reforms such as those of Trajan, the poorest citizens would constantly receive a very generous amount of bread, corn, or potatoes, making the population even more stable and in better nutritional health than originally, with the quality of life of the poorest no longer being as miserable and terrible as it was before the discovery of the Americas, thanks to all the riches brought from that continent. In that context, with a vastly superior population, and therefore with a much higher number of soldiers than normal, and with those eager to obtain new lands for their retirement, it would not be unreasonable to think that in this timeline Trajan would manage to conquer and totally annihilate the Parthians, annexing them as one more province of the Roman Empire by the simple raw numerical advantage of soldiers the Romans had, and with a gigantic population, it would be more profitable to conquer those new lands to offer them to veterans of the Roman army, with the number of soldiers in the army probably being over 2 million by then, and still increasing with the annexation and the loyalty of new men coming from Parthia. During the following decades of the Pax Romana, the empire would not stop its conquests, however. It would optimize the new lands it conquered with the purpose and interest of facilitating its trade routes with the Americas, now that trade with India and China was fully open. For example, with an overwhelming population, it is possible that Rome would begin to look for new alternative routes to reach the Americas, not only for trade, but to bring more and more settlers to the empire's colonies there, being able to conquer Britain and Ireland without many problems after a few years of military campaign, being able to cross the Atlantic from the north, discovering the still uninhabited Iceland at that time, later Greenland, until reaching the coasts of North America in what would be known in our reality as Terra Nova. From then on, over the next few years, the Romans would invest their time and money in connecting the entire east coast of America from the north in Terra Nova all the way to the Yucatan Peninsula, where the first colonies had already developed massively from their earliest days, being composed of millions of inhabitants with an urbanization worthy of the largest cities of the empire. By that point, it would be unlikely that the Romans, curious as they were, would not have already discovered the gigantic natural reserves of gold, being an unparalleled contribution to Roman value and economy, although, like the Spanish in our reality, it could end up being a double-edged sword if used incorrectly. The Antonine Plague would still occur in this timeline, but with a population vastly superior to our reality, and with that population having a superior quality of life and nutritional health, their organisms would not be so weakened, being able to better withstand that terrible plague, which, although it would have caused more deaths than in our history, in total, the population would still be much higher than in our timeline after that plague. With the overpopulation that the empire had, a superior quality of life, numbers of soldiers and resources abysmally higher, and with an Antonine Plague lesser in long-term consequences than in our timeline, during the 3rd century, the Romans would have been confronted with many challenges that here would have more plausible and approachable solutions to avoid a greater crisis, as was the crisis of the 3rd century in our reality. For example, with the onset of constant Germanic invasions that would progressively increase until they became too many in the following centuries, the Romans here, with a superior number of soldiers and population, could eventually, during the 3rd century, conquer and connect the entire Germanic world with the rest of their empire. Meanwhile, to slow down and better control the constant inflation of the Roman economy, the empire would begin to extract and export enormous quantities of gold from the New World, but taking care to not import too much gold and other precious metals in too much quantity at once in order to offset inflation at a stable and balanced level. However, such action by the central government of the empire, plus an exaggerated increase in taxes, would offend and frustrate many inhabitants of the Roman colonies in the Americas who, over the decades, might feel that they were being treated unfairly by the empire, artificially maintaining it with the enormous gold reserves that were discovered and excavated every year, in addition to having a tax increase higher than that of the inhabitants of the empire in the Old World, gradually creating resentment and a feeling of injustice which could end in a disastrous event for the empire. With that situation in hand, the empire might have overcome the difficulties of the 3rd century. However, the solutions they used to avoid a crisis in that century would lead the 4th century to experience an unprecedented crisis, one from which they would not have the slightest chance of recovering. After decades of abuses of power via massive gold imports and constant tax increases by the central government of the empire, the Roman colonies, now more powerful and numerous than ever, would begin to experience a strong feeling of independence from the Roman Empire of the Old World, thus initiating a civil war to free themselves from the central authority of the empire, starting a crisis without equal in the entire history of Roman civilization until then. Although the empire would send as many soldiers and loyal men as possible to stop this independence movement, the logistics behind such attempts to prevent the independence of the colonies would simply be too difficult and impossible to carry out. This is not the British Empire of the 18th century. Certainly, the Roman Empire of this timeline was far more technologically and military advanced than the Romans of our reality, with a superior technology and naval fleet with resources unmatched in their real history. However, they are still far from the technological and military level that the British Empire had during the American War of Independence, and it would not be as easy or quick for them to send troops to the colonies to stop the independence movement as the British did in our reality. Due to all of this, just a few years after the start of the War of Independence, the colonists managed to expel all central authority from the American Empire, thus founding their own state and empire independent of the Roman Empire in the mid-4th century. What would this new and young empire call itself? Difficult to say, but one could assume that culturally they would continue to call themselves Romans. However, the name of their territory would be different, and perhaps a perfect name would be the Latin term abundantia. Abundance in English, something like the Abundant Empire. Sorry if that name is lame, I don't have any other idea of the name for that new independent empire. In any case, the Roman Empire could not forget such humiliation and damage to its prestige, but by the 4th century, several problems would begin to accumulate that would make it impossible for the Roman Empire to try to reconquer those now independent lands, because all the problems that they had been postponing and delaying to avoid a bigger crisis like the crisis of the 3rd century in our reality would eventually happen anyway. Now, without the enormous financial support that were the rich lands of the Roman colonies, but also the progressive invasion of the Huns and an overpopulation that needed to be fed, the empire would have an internal crisis of monstrously greater scales than that of the 3rd century of our timeline, with that failing to survive united with so many problems at the same time, ending up bankrupt and collapsing into multiple small empires and kingdoms more or less at the same time as in our timeline, but this time without even an Eastern Roman Empire surviving. With these catastrophic events occurring in the Old World, the now abundant Empire of America would be free from all danger of receiving reconquest attempts by the Roman Empire, but not everything would be perfect for them from now on. Completely disconnected from the trade routes between the New and Old World, the abundant empire would no longer have anyone with whom to trade its abundant wealth, creating a small internal crisis due to these economic difficulties. To address these problems, the abundant empire would begin a series of conquests and expansions across the western edge of the American continent, but that would not be as easy of a task as they thought. Because after centuries of constant interactions with the Romans and deadly plagues for their organisms, the bodies of the surviving Native Americans would have adapted to the diseases of the Old World, obtaining total immunity to these plagues, being able to rebuild themselves and taking advantage of trade with the Roman settlers to develop as proto-societies, especially with the adoption of things from the Old World such as the horse, greatly facilitating the urbanization and centralization of power of the future and new Native American civilizations that the abundant empire would have to face in its mission to conquer the far west. But even then, having overcome these difficulties and reached the western coasts of the continent, the abundant empire would have to face another unpleasant surprise, which would immediately halt all the dreams of one day completely dominating the continent. For their greatest surprise and astonishment of the abundant empire, another old world power had arrived in the Americas to create its own colonial empire. China, in this reality, aware of the existence of the Americas and the complete halt of trade routes with the Roman Empire, would have decided to create those trade routes themselves to continue benefiting from the riches offered by that gigantic continent. And for the next few centuries, a brutal cultural and economic battle would rage between the abundant Romans and the Chinese, with the victor eventually determining who will ultimately dominate that continent and its riches, and eventually, who knows, dominate the entire world. And with that, I think this is a good moment to end this video. I hope you enjoyed this story. And if you want to delve deeper into this hypothetical scenario of the Romans escaping to the Americas, the content creator Unreal History created a video a while back about if Constantine XI had escaped to the Americas after the fall of Constantinople. If you want another perspective on this alternate possibility, I recommend watching his own video. He'll be releasing a sequel soon, or would have already released it by the time this video is published, so I highly recommend checking out his channel and subscribing to it. The link to his channel and the video will be in the description of this video. Anyway, don't forget to subscribe, like the video, become a member of the channel in order to have early access to new videos, and comment on what you thought of it. And without anything else to say, see you next time.